Good evening. So I want to welcome you to a great affair, and I want to welcome our online audience as well that might be watching it. I wanted to make sure they knew we had a live audience here too. Something real unique. We've got people here, we've got people online who will be participating via Twitter and also via Facebook and also watching it live. Great evening for us here. And by the way, for you online people and for those of you in the audience, feel free. Take out the cell phone or the mobile device. It's okay not to talk on the phone, but it will be okay to tweet and do anything else that you want to do. Here's the hashtag, and you need to know it. It is BUProfs, BUPROFS. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. Those of you who do know exactly what I'm talking about. For those of you in the online community, make sure that you use that hashtag as you talk about this event, and feel free to go ahead and send in your questions and comments, and we'll do our best during the question and answer period or the conversation period to try and make sure we get you involved. So we get to listen in on a great conversation to, I think, of the great folks that I have been following for some time. And I have this real honor and privilege to introduce them and to be able to moderate a bit of a conversation that we'll have with them. I'm going to get right to it because there's a lot to do here. First off, let me introduce to you Professor Andrew Bacevich, International Relations Professor here at the university, and certainly most folks will say an expert. He has recently written a book that I've had a chance to read, and it's called Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War. On your right, my left, is Stephen Prothero, professor of religion here at the university. God is Not One is his latest book. Now, I was told that to get the two of them on stage meant that I should not be in the middle, and I should certainly just duck. And I'm not going to do that. I'm going to actually have a seat and listen in. And I'm going to jump in at some point and try and get us engaged in the conversation. So, Professor Bacevich, Professor Prothero, I'm turning it over to you. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Elmore. We had a little coin toss, and I was elected to start. So I'll say something quickly. I was reminded as I was invited to do this event of a couple years ago. I went to find a book called The Irony of American History, which I had bought in college, written by the Protestant neo-Orthodox theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. And I don't remember now exactly why I needed the book 2 years ago, but I needed it sort of desperately, and I looked around my bookshelves in my office and my bookshelves at home, and I couldn't find it. I didn't know exactly what it looked like. I knew it had kind of checked blue and gray checked cover with boring letters, and I couldn't find it, and so I said, all right, I'm just going to order it online. So I ordered it online, and I got this book, The Irony of American History, and I opened it up, and I found out the introduction was written by Professor Bacevich, and I had followed his work, but I hadn't really read his work before. I had seen him on television and some radio programs. And I opened the introduction to this 1952 book on the irony of American history, and I read that, according to Professor Bacevich, this is the most important book ever written in U.S. foreign policy. And I thought, this is really strange because it really isn't even a book about foreign policy, and it's not written by a statesman, it's written by a theologian. What a strange sort of claim. And then I read the introduction, the very first sentence, "The times in which we live call for a Niebuhrian revival." So I thought I would start our conversation by asking if you could say something, Andrew, about Reinhold Niebuhr and explain why, in your view, he's relevant to our foreign policy conversations today.
Well, the book was written in the early days of the Cold War. Perhaps a moment not unlike the immediate post-9/11 period, in that it was informed by a great deal of conviction and certainty that international politics could be seen as a moral contest pitting good against evil, with the United States representing the forces of evil and therefore empowered to confer on itself vast prerogatives and to dodge serious moral questions about American power and its use. Niebuhr, to my mind, was an important voice of dissent that was heard at that moment, challenging Americans to question their first-order assumptions. Not least among those assumptions had to do with who we are as a people, what we represent, and what our historical purposes are. And to cut to the chase, and I think this is what makes the book, lends the book its enduring relevance, is that Niebuhr emphasizes the role of our own sense of chosenness and singularity as providing the foundation or well springs, justification, impetus for what we do in the world. And it's in that sense, I think, that this book by a theologian just illuminates the foreign policy landscape and permits us to see that landscape in startlingly different ways.
So is one of the core ideas that when we do foreign policy, we're motivated not just by political, strategic, military questions, but also by theological questions? I mean, one word, you used the word certainty, you didn't use the word sin, which is the word that Niebuhr wants to use, which, and the way he comes at this notion that we need to be humble, we need to be careful of hubris in our foreign policy activities is because human beings aren't God, because human beings don't know everything, because unintended consequences are always around the corner. Similarly, the notion of the chosen people idea that somehow whatever we do may be sanctified, sanctioned by God, that we have a kind of messianic project as a nation to go out and maybe not convert everyone to Jesus, but at least convert everyone to democracy. There's a lot of theological baggage going on there. Do you think that our presidents and our State Department people who are making some of these decisions are motivated by a kind of unconscious theological project, or is theology just a kind of way to illuminate what's going on in terms of foreign policy, quite separate from religion?
I think that there have been times when the theological element has been quite explicit. Frankly, I think that the immediate post-9/11 period. I mean, my own interpretation of President George W. Bush, I mean, it's very difficult to peer inside someone else's heart, but my own sense of George Bush as a man is that religiosity forms a very important part in making him who he is. That Bush, as a student of foreign policy the day before 9/11, someone who frankly hadn't thought a lot about it, but nonetheless viewed himself as kind of a soft, mushy realist who didn't believe in nation building, as he said. That for President Bush, 9/11 served as a conversion experience in a very powerful way. And 24 hours later, he had come to emphatically believe in this American mission, which was articulated in secular terms. I mean, the mission was to export freedom and democracy, but which I think in his particular case really drew upon this sense of religious identity that was his. And I think that he is a striking example of that, but he's not the only example. I suspect that Woodrow Wilson, who in some respects Bush came to resemble, was also motivated by a deep sense of religiosity. That said, there are other moments in our history when the missionary impulse is articulated in ways that are more secular than they are religious. And one would cite, for example, the 1840s, the run-up to the Mexican War, which was articulated in terms of our supposed manifest destiny. If you go back and look at the writings of somebody like John L. O'Sullivan, who was a very influential journalist at the time, he doesn't talk about God, but he does talk about this providential purpose of the United States, which therefore not only justifies what was in fact a war of aggression against Mexico, but made that war both necessary and invested it with a higher and larger purpose.
You know, it seems like in terms of U.S. history, and in terms of this use of either religious or secular reasoning for our projects, right? Our expansion projects that you're so critical of in your work. It seems to me that that goes back to Massachusetts. It goes back to the Puritan era. It goes back to the Sermon on the Arabella, where Governor Winthrop says, you know, we are a city on the hill, to which President Reagan, in his ebullience and optimism, adds the word shining, which I love. You know, we can't just be the city on the hill that everybody from Europe is looking to. We have to be shining. It sort of is going to blind them in some ways by our brilliance. But in that speech, he has at the end, he ends it with this sort of if then sort of thing, where it's very much open-ended about whether this project is going to succeed. It's very much open-ended about whether the covenant that we've entered into with God is going to lead God to bless us, or whether it's going to lead God to curse us, because it might well be that we don't pursue mercy and justice, and it might well be that we do pursue our own selfish ends and seek to become rich, which he warns us explicitly against doing. And so it seems to me on this chosen people kind of question that comes up with Manifest Destiny, and it comes up with Reagan, and I think it definitely comes up after 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that part of what we've lost is a sense that God may not just be on our side. You know, God may be mad at us for doing things that we should not be doing. I wonder whether that to you is a kind of sufficient chastening device, or whether we just need to get rid entirely of this chosen covenantal notion, and whether that notion is just irredeemable.
Well, we're never going to get rid of it, I think. I think it's one of these, this sense of singularity of American exceptionalism, I'm personally persuaded is just hardwired into who we are. I think the challenge is to try to direct that sense of singularity in directions that the results can be positive. I think it's very important. It would be good for people to read Winthrop's sermon in its detail, and to understand the context within which the phrase city on a hill appears. I agree completely with your reading that this covenant that Winthrop insisted had been forged between his little band of followers and God Almighty was a contingent arrangement, and the purposes for which his community had been summoned focused principally on fulfilling God's word. And this is all spoken in a Christian context. And the sermon is laced with emphatic commands that, you know, we will conduct ourselves in ways that are consistent with the followings of Jesus Christ. We will love one another. We will turn away from the things of the world. We will live as brothers. And if we don't do that, he says, then we will be, as a byword, we will be cursed. Cursed not only by God, but by subsequent generations whom we will have failed. I think one of the things that rather quickly vanishes from this sense of American exceptionalism is that it includes a rather specific and demanding moral burden. Instead, American exceptionalism tends to become a device that confers prerogatives more than it imposes responsibilities.
You know, I think one of the things that you see in the Winthrop sermon, and you also see in Reinhold Niebuhr, is this sense of uncertainty. That we have a sense that we're in this situation with God, but God is God and humans are humans, and so we don't really know at any moment exactly what's going to happen, right?
Exactly right. My sense is that apart from somebody like George W. Bush, American exceptionalism today tends to get expressed in more secular language. But if you went and took a look, for example, at President-elect Obama's Grant Park speech, the speech he gave on the night that he was elected, incredible event. And one of the things that he said was, he reminded his listeners, all the American people, that we were called to bend the arc of history. And I thought, what an extraordinary claim. I mean, to say that you're called upon to bend the arc of history is to imply that history has a trajectory, it has a destination, that there's some intended place where history is going to end. Now that does have, I think, a religious, implicit religious aspect to it, but simply as a citizen of the world, casting your gaze back on the narrative of history, just in the past 100 years, it's preposterous, I think, to claim that history has some predetermined end, and it's truly preposterous to claim that we can know what that end is, or that American power can somehow be mustered to bring history to this intended destination. But Americans believe that that's not preposterous. And that belief, I think, that history has a purpose, we can understand history's purpose, we are called upon to fulfill history's purpose, this is kind of a secular updating of the religiously informed version of American exceptionalism.
So he's conjuring Martin Luther King there, right? When King is saying, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, right? So Obama is trying to conjure up King there and to say, okay, we can bend the arc of history. So I'm wondering.
See, that didn't occur to me.
No. Oh, go ahead.
No, I mean, it didn't occur to me because my own sense of Dr. King, who I dare say you've studied much more closely than I have, is that he would be far more tentative in declaring history's purpose.
That's what I wanted to ask you, because I'm wondering, to go back to a conversation between Niebuhr, who, according to my friend David Chappelle, who wrote this wonderful book called Stone of Hope, he makes the argument that the key influence on King is Niebuhr. That Martin Luther King, when he was here studying at Boston University, he was totally immersed in the writings of Niebuhr. And I've never thought of King as a kind of hubristic person who knew where history was going, and yet I think certainly he believed, as a person of Christian faith and as a theologian, that the arc of history was bent toward justice, and he believed this with the Hebrew Bible prophets. And yet I'm with him on that, but I'm also with you on saying, who are we to know? The theological way is to say the purposes of God, but the historical way that Niebuhr puts it in Irony of American History is to know where history is going. Right?
Isn't a distinction here, and I'm asking the question, I don't know, that when Dr. King says that the arc of history turns towards justice, is his message not one to individuals, summoning them to live their lives in such a way that the cause of justice will be advanced, whereas the architects of American foreign policy who claim to know where the arc of history, they're not calling on the people of Iran to live their lives differently. They're basically cocking a gun so they can go tell the people, make the people of Iran live the way Americans think they should live.
When we engage in the Vietnam War, right, King is there to say, and I wish I had the quote on, it was in the God in America TV series, if some of you saw, the great quote from King, where King says, basically, we need to be careful here in Vietnam because it may just be that God's going to come after us, right? I mean, it was very much like Winthrop, It was, but it wasn't like Winthrop in the future, it was sort of like, don't you see now? We are, in this case, I think, the prophetic voice was, we're on the wrong side of history. But even that assumes we kind of know what side God is on in history, and we just happen to be on the other side, as opposed to, I think the more Niebuhr position is, who are we to know, right? There's too much of a gap between God and us, or in the secular way to say, there's too much information flow for us to figure out, to be able to say, and then to jump forward, oh, we'll go into Iraq, and this will happen, and that will happen, and then A, B, C, D, and then all of a sudden, this will be the case. I mean, I think that's where I may want to pull you into this conversation about Iraq and Afghanistan that isn't part of the Niebuhrian position that you take up in both your book on the limits of power and the Washington Rules, that it's just hubristic of us to think we can have enough information, enough certainty to know, especially given how little we know about the religious and cultural facts on the ground in these countries, that we can enter into them and do anything that's really constructive. I mean, isn't that your position?
Sure, but it's also, I mean, I think a Niebuhrian sort of take on this is, yes, we must acknowledge the existence of evil in the world, that somebody like Saddam Hussein is truly evil, and at the same time, that doesn't mean that we represent all that is good. That we must be aware of, attempt to be aware of our own faults, failings, limitations, and to some degree that perhaps could help you exercise a certain element of self-restraint and avoid going off and do stupid things. In Irony of American History, Niebuhr is quite explicit, for example, in condemning preventive war as morally unacceptable and stupid. Now he's making this condemnation in the context of a prospective preventive nuclear attack against the Soviet Union, which of some people, not many, advocated early in the Cold War when we had a significant nuclear advantage. It's hard for me to read that condemnation of preventive war circa 1952 and not see its applicability to the war of preventive doctrine that President Bush articulated in 50 years later, and what folly it was.
Yeah. To go to Bush, whom we mentioned before, after 9/11, he was incredibly outspoken on this question of Islam, right? That we are not going to war with Islam. We are going to war with evil, we're going to war with terror. Islam is a religion of peace. He said the sort of things now that, he said the sort of things then that no Democrat running for office now would dare to say because they couldn't get elected. He sounds, when you go back and look at what he said, not even 10 years ago, like someone who you'd call a communist and a socialist for his crazy, left-wing leanings when it comes to Islam. What do you think about the course of the Islam conversation? Islam is we're engaged in a clash of civilizations. Are we engaged in a clash of civilizations? And was Bush right to push us toward this more, teddy bear kind of reading of Islam? Or is that itself a kind of naivete that we need to be warned against?
Well, I mean, on September 11th, 2001, what did the average American know about Islam? What did I know about Islam? Next to nothing. This, we would now, I think, all agree, represented a vast failure in our education, our understanding of the world and what's important in the world. I suspect where President Bush's effort to propagate the teddy bear image of Islam failed is that that image was offered against the backdrop of our collective ignorance. We probably ought to, on September 12th, we probably ought to sort of call cease work across the entire country and adjourned everything and had a week-long seminar for every American citizen to learn what Islam is all about so we could then have an intelligent political conversation. That education didn't happen, and therefore, over time, demagogues have the opportunity to advance a different perception of Islam, and we don't know enough to refute it. Not we, I mean some of us. Right. To some degree, these outlandish characterizations find a certain amount of purchase in certain quarters of our society.
Do you think it's different in the foreign policy apparatus in the United States in terms of what people who work in the State Department or even in the Department of Defense or even in the White House know about the religions of the world? I mean, one of the arguments that I've made in my last couple books is that to understand the world and to act in the world politically and militarily, we need to know something about Hinduism in India. We need to know something about Islam to deal with Indonesia. It seems to me our foreign policy has, at least in my recent memory, been working on the assumption that all we need is the tools of political science and economics. In other words, human beings are motivated by greed and power, and that's all we need to know. Would you agree with me that we need not just a week-long seminar for the country to talk about Islam, but we need more than a week-long seminar for our ambassadors, people in the Department of State, etc., if they want for our military, our counter-terrorists, our intelligence efforts overseas to be successful?
I'd emphatically agree, and yet I wonder even if we invested the necessary effort to provide that kind of education, if it would do any good. My sense is that in that world, in the world of statecraft, in the military world, there's a tendency always on the part of people in that world to want to harness the knowledge, to put it to work. One of my graduate students was reading a book, I think it was a week ago, about, we were talking about U.S.-Saudi relations in the 1950s, and there was a serious proposal in the State Department that basically was advancing this notion. Well, the King of Saudi Arabia is the self-proclaimed protector of the Muslim holy places, so that gives him particular influence all across the Islamic world. We have influence with the King of Saudi Arabia, so if we can basically elevate his status so that he will be the equivalent of the Pope in Rome, then we will be able to influence, have a means of influencing U.S.-Muslim relations. Well, I'm sorry, the King of Saudi Arabia is never going to be the equivalent of the Pope in Rome, but I cite that as an example, I think, of people, whether they know a lot about religion or a little bit about religion, given the business they're in, they're probably going to distort that knowledge or use that knowledge for purposes that don't necessarily make sense.
Mm-hmm. So that sounds like a grim picture to me. And
I'm in the pessimism business.
Yeah, I know. And you know, one thing that struck me about both of your last two books is that you go after these political figures, but you also kind of go after all the rest of us too. You know, you go after the people in this room and myself for being in a way complicit with these Washington rules, as you call them, with the sort of assumptions about American exceptionalism, the uses of American power, and that we aren't doing our job to say no to our representatives, right? And we're not doing our job to educate ourselves about what's going on in terms of...
We're not doing our job to say, well, what is the definition of freedom? What does it mean to live in freedom? What does it mean to be a free human being? Should it mean something more than walking around and, you know, paging through messages on your, whatever it's called?
Well, let's ask the dean here. He knows that all that hashtag talk. So what should we do then? What should we, you know, ordinary people who are not, you know, majors in international relations or professors of history and international relations, what is there for us to do? You know, part of what I push for people to do is to learn something about the world's religions so that they can engage in intelligent ways in this conversation about Islam in America or wherever else comes up. Who knows if Kashmir is the next big thing? We might need to know something about Hinduism, right? But what do you think? I mean, we have an election coming up. I'm not going to ask you who we should vote for governor or whatever else, but I mean, what can we do to address this problem, this kind of hubristic, aggressive American foreign policy that's sort of thrashing around with crazy schemes about Saudi Arabia and incredibly naive assumptions about what we can do in Iraq and Afghanistan? What can we do as ordinary American citizens and as college students?
I think,
besides join you in your pessimism.
No. My answer is, because I've been asked this question before, my answer is completely inadequate, but it's the one I believe to be true, and that is that we each should ask ourselves, we each should attempt to identify our vocation, because we are all different people with different talents and different temperaments, but we all have some, I believe, some purpose in life. And there is far too little time, I think, I suspect even in a great university, devoted to asking the question, where do I fit? I'm not an activist kind of person. I don't organize. I don't wish to have a public life in the sense of being in politics. That's not for me. But there are other people who I think are called upon to political activism, to running for office. Those people need to step up to the plate. There are other people who are called upon to live a private life, a decent life, to raise their family, to be a good neighbor, to make sure the garbage gets put out and the grass gets mowed. And if we had 310 of our fellow citizens who adhered to that vocation, we'd be in great shape. So I think it is a need to reflect in order to identify that calling, that place, and then to disregard the expectations of society at large or your parents or whatever, and go do that.
I think we're going to open it up to questions pretty soon, but maybe can I say one more thing? One source of common ground, I think, in both of our writing, as I was thinking about this conversation, is a sort of distrust of simple schemes. So in my last book, I talk about how there's this common idea that the religions are basically the same, that they're different paths up the same mountain, and really, yeah, people pretend Islam is different from Christianity, but it's really not, and people pretend Sunni and Shia Muslims are different from one another, but they're really not, because it's really simple if you think about it, right? And I think in religion, there's a temptation for many people to do that. I think in politics and foreign affairs, the temptation may even be greater, because we want to imagine that there's simple solutions, right? Because otherwise, if there aren't, we're in deep trouble, right? And I think this may take us back to Niebuhr, because a big part of Niebuhr, as I read him, is that that's the great seduction. The simple scheme is, to use theological language, that's more likely to be the devil talking to you than God talking to you, because the world's complicated. Could you talk about simple and complicated and certainty and doubt when it comes to foreign affairs? And,
I think you're exactly right. I think President Bush's, it sounds like this is beat up President Bush night, but President Bush's freedom agenda, I think, would be an example of that. I mean, in one sense, it's based on propositions that I don't think any of us are willing to argue with. Nobody wishes to live in a society in which the secret police can come knock on your door and throw you in jail. Nobody wishes to live in a society in which you're denied the right to worship or to speak. Of course, that's true. But to leap from there to the notion that freedom as manifested in the United States of America is somehow the authoritative version, and that the United States, with all of its power should arrogate to itself the prerogative to deliver that freedom really denies to the rest of the world the opportunity to proffer alternative versions of freedom that probably will to some degree overlap with ours, but won't necessarily be identical. So I think that there is this search for simple solutions. In our own day, the search for simple solutions has been compounded by a post-Cold War belief that superior American military power provides us with the ready-made instrument to implement those simple solutions. And that reflected a vast overestimation of that power and a vast misunderstanding of the nature of war.
I'm going to jump in right now. We're here with Professor Stephen Prothero, Professor of Religion, and Andrew Bacevich, Professor of International Relations here. They're having a great conversation, and we want to see if we can get more of us into the conversation. So if you have a question, and for the folks here, if you have a question, just raise your hand. Make sure you're speaking to the mic so we can hear you and catch you on the feed. For those of you who may be part of the online community, simply go ahead and text in or type in, and we'll make sure to try and get a few of you in as well. So I see we've got a question right here.
Yeah, you spoke about American values based on the Puritan value system. This country is actually made up of a multiplicity of value systems. There were the Quakers, there were the Scots-Irish, there were the Planters, and then later the Catholics, Jews, Lutherans who came into the country. Given this multiplicity of value systems, you have to ask yourself, why is a particular value system chosen? Whose interest does it serve? I mean, it was very interesting for me to read in Last Call that the reason Prohibition was repealed was primarily because Pierre DuPont invested millions of dollars into repealing it because he thought he'd get his income tax lower. So I want to know is who's funding these value systems? I want to know who is funding these apocalyptic Christians who make up such a tiny portion even of the evangelical community and who are quite clearly lunatics. And who's behind it? I mean, is it the military-industrial complex? Is it multinational corporations? Is it imperial interests? It boggles the mind.
Is that for me? Nice guy. I think the notion that Americans are God's chosen people, that this is an exceptional place, that we have a key role to play in history, that it's our job to spread democracy. I do think that that has roots in Calvinism, which spreads out into other religious ideologies, but I don't think that that's a lunatic fringe. I think that's mainstream America. I think it's really mainstream. And I think that it's a mistake to think of this kind of project that seeks to exert the power of the American military in service of improving and perfecting even the world, to see that as somehow evangelical and narrow. I think it's a rare American who doesn't believe this. This is one of the main points of your last two books, isn't it? That this isn't just crazy President Bush with his wacky, conversations with Jesus. This is everyone, and it doesn't really require a DuPont or a Bill Gates to fund it, because we all kind of grow up believing in this sort of special exceptionalism of America. So I wouldn't disagree, especially in this political climate, that there's a lot of money that is secret, that we don't know where it's going. I think that that's a shame. But at the same time, I'm not sure that the ideas that I see at least fueling some of our American military adventures come from any sort of wacky place. I think they come from pretty mainstream American values that are shared now across a lot of different religious traditions.
We've got a question right here.
Hi. I just finished reading The Irony of American History in one of my classes. It was a great book. And one thing that we talked about in my class was that Niebuhr always stresses the middle ground. He explains both sides, American exceptionalism, American hegemony, and he talks about the irony of how we could believe in our own exceptionalism and use that as a justification to spread our hegemony, but then are we really exceptional if we're doing something like that? So pretty much his message was to stress the tension between two extremes. But it seems that in our history, people have interpreted his books to make very polarized foreign policy decisions. Why is that, and how can we stop that? Because in my view, and I guess in your view from reading your introduction, you think that his message is one of more caution and to make a more reasoned, pragmatic choice.
But you ask, why have people throughout history interpreted his views a particular way?
How can they interpret his views to make, like, for example, very specifically, how can they use his book or his ideas to prefer isolationism or interventionism when what he's stressing is a middle ground between the two?
Well, I don't know. I don't think that's the way his book has been interpreted. I mean, one point to make is that the book had largely vanished until just a couple of years ago when this new paperback edition came out. Before the paperback edition came out, I was using the book every year. My students were paying like $40 a piece just to find one on the used book market. So the book, I think, had pretty much disappeared. My sense is that the political context in which the book was written was this. Niebuhr was a Cold Warrior. He supported the basic opposition of the United States to the Soviet Union as a necessary posture. The middle ground I think he was trying to take was the middle ground between a lunatic fringe that wanted to find an immediate end to the rivalry with the Soviet Union by starting a war on the one hand, and on the other hand, the isolationist remnant of the Republican Party that, from Niebuhr's point of view, would not have been sufficiently assertive. So in a sort of a narrow political context of an argument going on at that time, he's trying to chart a middle path.
Can I say something quick on this question about why he could be interpreted differently? And we may have a slight disagreement here. I think he has been, Niebuhr, interpreted wildly differently. There was a famous interview that pre-President Obama did with David Brooks, the New York Times, where Brooks asked him about Niebuhr, and all of a sudden Obama was just going on with these long extended paragraphs about Niebuhr, this huge influence, Niebuhr. And it was almost as if when George Bush was asked, who's your favorite political philosopher, it was Jesus, and when Obama was asked, it was Niebuhr. But at the same time, Niebuhr was the favorite philosopher of the neocons who were all about crusading out and going out. I think the reason for it already is Professor Bacevich alluded to before. He says the cautionary piece is we can never know. There are always unintended consequences. We never know what our actions will bring forward in terms of their actual fruits in the world. There's a huge gap between our knowledge of the world situation and the way the world situation really is. All these are red kind of, stoplights, right, toward action. Now that may lead you to a kind of total isolationism, we can't do anything. But then he makes this move that Professor Bacevich just referred to earlier, which is, but we must act, right? That's the key part. We have to be willing to sully ourselves. We can't be purists. We can't be sort of monastics who are going to make sure that we never do anything wrong or evil in a world that's filled with evil. So we need to act. We need to act, though, with the awareness that the things that we do may, in fact, dirty our hands. They may, in fact, backfire. So he has it both ways, too, right? I mean, he's not giving any clear, message about stay away because too many unintended consequences and forge ahead, right? So it makes sense to me that people could read him both ways, depending on which part of a sentence or which paragraph in a chapter they're going to emphasize.
We have folks who are watching this online, so we've got a question from the online community.
Yes, this question's from Twitter. It's from Pretty Boy Zay. That's the name.
I follow him.
Yeah, there you go. It's, what is the definition of freedom?
Oh, that's definitely you. No, that's you.
Well, as you said, we live in a pluralistic and diverse society. So it would be wrong, I think, for any one person to insist that there's any one definition of freedom. I think that all I would say is that to define freedom in terms of conspicuous consumption, radical individual autonomy, that's an inadequate definition. And I think it's also an unsustainable definition and deeply corrosive in terms of the prospects of having a genuine democracy. So I'm not going to tell you what the definition is, but we need to think about it.
And I'll only add that I'm pretty sure that Martin Luther King said that the arc bends toward freedom, not toward justice, right? Not that he doesn't think it also goes to justice, but I'm remembering now, I was misquoting him.
The arc is long and it bends towards freedom.
Thank you. Thank you.
We've got a question right here.
Given the fact that history is a very past experience for us, and as you were talking about, we can never know what the implications of our actions are, it seems to me that it follows that we can never know what the implications of our inaction are. And is it the case that we should let the fact that we may be hypocrites, or that just because someone else is evil, we may also carry tinges of evil ourselves? It seems to me that to allow the fear of misaction to rule us is just as harmful. To be so afraid of changing history in a negative way to stop us from acting when it's necessary, despite our own shortcomings. And how might that affect our view of religion, particularly because many of them call for severe action in many situations, and many of them promote pacifism or provoke peace. It seems to me like there is a very large conflict there. And you discuss how religions are very complex. It's not just a simple divide or a simple unity between them. In what ways should we take into consideration the different callings that people may feel to act in light of just allowing evil to prevail?
Want to do that?
Well, we shouldn't allow evil to prevail. I mean, this again goes back, I think, to one of the core Niebuhrian message, but in some senses, a message is not tremendously helpful to a president who's sitting at his desk trying to make a decision about whether or not to go to war. Yes, we should be modest. Yes, we should appreciate the likelihood of unintended consequences. Yes, we should understand that the future is opaque. Yes, we should understand that evil is out there and to some degree needs to be dealt with. And on the other hand, we've got to do something. So all of that, I think, counsels in favor of modesty, of trying to do the best you can to anticipate the unintended consequences, knowing that you will always be wrong, to avoid being overextended. In other words, to maintain some power in reserve so that when these unintended consequences appear, you have perhaps some ability to cope with them. I don't think, and that may sound general and generic, I think it has a specific application. Again, to pick on President Bush, the invasion of Iraq was planned and executed with a very high level of expectation that existing U.S. military forces would be more than sufficient to accomplish the mission. And indeed, if you look at the March on Baghdad, you could say that events seem to vindicate that expectation. If you look at the events that occurred after the fall of Baghdad, clearly the Bush administration failed to have adequate U.S. military power to deal with the contingents that they had to deal with. And so we end up trying to make up the difference by hiring mercenaries with, again, all kinds of other negative consequences. Had President Bush really believed what he said, was that we were engaging in an open-ended, he didn't say open-ended, long-term global war on terror, if he wished to have war be the antidote to terror, I think it's a bad idea, but if he wished to do that, then he ought to have mobilized the country. He ought to have raised up a greater pool of military power to then be able to apply to Iraq or wherever else as the case may be. I think Niebuhr would not have approved.
Before we go to the next question, can I just follow up? You're sounding like such a liberal to me tonight, and I don't think of you as that. So maybe you can say something bad about President Obama?
Oh, yes, I can.
Okay.
Do you want to do that now, or you want to save it?
No, I mean, I think President Obama promised that he was going to change the way Washington works, and I certainly entertained a very small hope that that effort to change would affect the fundamentals of U.S. national security policy. I think the Afghanistan decision of 2009 was his opportunity to show that he intended to bring change in that sphere of our politics, and he squandered the opportunity. And I think in that decision made clear that there would be more continuity than discontinuity between his administration and his predecessor. And I regret that decision, and I think that he too may eventually regret it.
Professor Bacevich, you ask, I read a recent New Republic piece that you did, and you pose a really interesting question in that as you look at belief and belief in this war, belief in certainly the war in Iraq, and also the way that President Bush looked at it versus the way President Obama did. I think you pose a really interesting question. Could you pose that a little bit for us?
Well,
I mean, it's great to think about this.
Again, this is people like me presuming to be able to read someone else's heart. But my sense is that when he made that decision, he did not wish to make that decision. If you watch it, to escalate in Afghanistan. When you look at that West Point speech, it's very interesting, the West Point, where he announced the decision. In the West Point speech, on the one hand, he announces we're going to implement the McChrystal Plan, and at the conclusion of the speech, he says, what we really need to be doing is rebuilding this country and rebuilding this economy. I think that was spoken from the heart. When you look at the Bob Woodward book that's been getting so much press, more press than other books get, written by other people, one of the very interesting things to come out of the Woodward book is that...
I've never heard of that book, by the way.
Right. That the president, in the run-up to that Afghanistan decision, the president demanded to be presented with real options. He wanted to be the person to make the basic decision on how to go forward in Afghanistan. And the people in the Pentagon who were working up whatever the decision paper was gave him 3 variants of a single option. Mr. President, we need a big decision today. Would you like to send 10,000 more troops to Afghanistan, or 20,000, or 30,000? And according to Woodward, the president responded to this by saying, you're only giving me one option. Choice is being taken from me and exercised by somebody else who knows what they want to do in Afghanistan. He knew he was being gamed, and he let him get away with it. I think that's deeply troubling from any number of perspectives, not least of which is what it tells us about the way the principle of civilian control actually works. And the answer is not well.
Doesn't this also fit into your point that you've also made, that presidential power in a way is overrated, right? that there's a way in which they're a figurehead for all these things that are happening around them, that it's very difficult for them to resist, right? I mean, Eisenhower talked about the military-industrial complex, but you talk about the Washington rules, that this is just sort of the way it works. And it's very hard for even someone, I mean, if Obama can't do it, right, the change agent,
but this
who's
also
gonna
comes
do it?
back. This also comes back to the question of our own culpability. We have bought into the notion of a messianic president. I mean, the enormous enthusiasm that accompanied the 2008 election, I would argue, centered on the expectation that if we can just get this man in office, then everything will be changed. That was an illusion, and I think events have demonstrated that that is an illusion. So simply finding the right person and installing that person in the Oval Office is not going to fix things.
Okay, you just heard from Professor Andrew Bacevich. Also sitting up there is Professor Stephen Prothero. We've got a question right over here.
What does America's basic inaction in response to war and genocide in Sudan have to say about how our leaders view America's role in the world?
I think what it says is this: that the mission to transform the world, the self-assigned mission to transform the world, becomes operative, becomes the basis for the expenditure of large-scale resources, only when doing so appears to be congruent with more substantive national interests. Where the perception of national interest is not present, then policymakers will tend to find a reason to argue that values that are under attack or human rights that are being violated on a large scale doesn't necessarily justify action.
We've got a question right over here.
I'm sure we're not the first ones or only ones or society that either has believed that we're the chosen people or does believe this. So I was wondering what makes our belief in this so different from other societies in the past or currently that believe this, and if there are other societies that closely parallel our belief, what we can learn from them.
Yeah, we're definitely not the only society. I know I read an angry response to the God in America TV series that I was involved with that recently was aired on PBS, where someone was saying, how do these people say that Americans think they're the only special country? You know, everybody thinks they're a special country. And I was thinking, you know, what show were you watching? Like, I know that, you know, it's not news to me. My mentor in graduate school, William Hutchison, did a book maybe 15 years ago that's specifically about the chosen people idea and how it plays out in South Africa, how it played out in France even, oddly enough, how it had played out in Germany, how it played out in England, which is where we got it from the British, how it's played out in the United States. So there are variants of, well, the political name for this is nationalism, right? But this is a narrower form of nationalism, which is a kind of divinely inspired nationalism. And in this case, nationalism that's divinely inspired that comes out of particular reading of the Hebrew Bible and the Israelites' specialness before God. And all those countries I named have appropriated that, very specific. You know, we're the new Israel, right? We're you know, our leaders are the new Moses. God is with us, taking us from out of slavery into freedom, right? We have the pillar of fire, you know, at night, leading us through the desert. So yes, I think what's the difference? I mean, I think one huge difference now is American power, right? So we have at least the illusion of the capacity that we can make this happen, that we know what the world needs to be, right? That we have this thing called democracy or freedom or whatever it might be, and that it's sort of stingy of us not to go and impose it on the rest of the world. I don't think that we can get away from a theological reading of America. I think it's too deeply rooted in us. I think the way to go is toward theological views of the country that are less hubristic, right? Like this idea of the conditional covenant. The Puritans in colonial New England did not have this idea that they could go out and do all this stuff and God was always patting them on the back. I mean, they were always sort of like looking behind them whenever they did anything, like, are we going to get slapped for that, you know? They always had this fear of God. We don't have a fear of God anymore. We just have this, you know, God's on our side kind of idea without that sense of danger or what used to be called holiness or the sacred about God. So I guess I would see that as being the difference, that we have more power and therefore our use of the chosen people idea is more dangerous, and then we've forgotten the sort of salutary pieces of that mythology that would produce in us a kind of fear or caution before we go out crusading in the name of the Almighty.
Got a question right here.
Were either of you surprised by the overwhelming reaction to the Florida pastor who was going to burn the Korans? You know, I feel like almost, this is going to be oversimplistic, but if somebody in Florida had said, I'm going to burn some Bibles, we all just would have said, oh, good for you, and don't bother us again. I was just taken aback by the reaction of it. What's your take on it?
I'll address that, and then I'd love to hear what you make of the idea of General Petraeus saying that this was a, you know, problem for us overseas. But I wasn't surprised. I mean, I think that there are. I mean, when I saw what happened at the Islamic Community Center in Manhattan, I was surprised, and I think I was intrigued by my own naivete. You know, I've argued in the past that I think the culture wars are overblown, that the culture wars are happening more on TV than they are out in mainstream America. And I was surprised to see that ramp up the way it ramped up, and the way in which the sort of comments about Islam and about Muslims that I have read before, because I read the comments that people write to me when I write on CNN's Belief blog. I know there's a kind of crazy and sick anger out there, but when I saw those same kind of comments move up into culture brokers, into religious leaders like Franklin Graham, and into political leaders like Newt Gingrich and Sarah Palin, I was surprised by that. I was surprised by the capacity of Americans to express at such a visceral level their hatred towards Muslims. But then, we did have a different reaction to there weren't that many people saying, you know, burn the book, burn the book. I mean, there were a few, but they were really muffled. And even the people who were coming out against the Ground Zero, so-called Ground Zero Mosque, were coming out against that. And I think there are just limits to which American intolerance will go, and we found a limit there, you know. But I'm curious about, you know, one of the claims about that was that that wasn't big news. Like, one of the big takeaways afterwards was the media made too much of it, and then the media responded, well, once General Petraeus said that this was endangering our troops, we had to cover it. And I'm wondering if you could address that, if you think that makes sense, and similarly with the Islamic Community Center conversation, is there a sense that that undermines, do you have a sense that that undermines our efforts at the sort of hearts and minds piece of what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan?
A couple of comments. First is, I think that it is striking, I think, and troubling that a four-star field commander weighs in on these matters, and it's only when General Petraeus says that the proposed burning of the Qurans is a problem that somehow that matters. I mean, it is an enormous this informal shift of authority toward specific senior military officers is something that ought to make a lot of people very uncomfortable. But it is a reality of
Because
our...
of the civilian,
of
we
our-
should have civilians in charge of the military.
I sort of think that.
Right.
That's a problem, I think, today. I have to say my own sense of the Koran burning episode was International Burn a Koran Day. Was I did think it was trumped up by the media. I remember going to the gym where I should be right now, and they always have CNN on. And of course, CNN is just 24/7. You got to fill up the airtime with something. And they were just flogging that story over and over and over again in ways that to me seemed completely mindless. So I was in the camp that said that the story would have faded much more quickly had not it gotten that level of media attention.
And then when the Pastor Jones, I think was his name, said, okay, call off, we're not going to do it, then this guy from the Westboro Baptist Church, Reverend Phelps, he's like, okay, we'll do it, In fact, we did it a couple years ago. Nobody paid any attention. And then at that point, there was the media fatigue. It wasn't, people didn't race to Fred Phelps. Like, is he going to burn? How's he going to do it? How many is he going to burn? So there was a way. I think the media also felt trapped by it. That they felt, especially when he said, no, I won't do it. And then he said, wait a minute, maybe I will do it. That's when the media was like, oh my gosh, we are so being played here. He's totally got us by, the strings.
Do you think there's similar kind of things going on with the so-called Ground Zero Mosque? You get the president weighing in on what some people think is a fairly local issue and starts to give it more of an international implication. You've got people who also say, too, that it's a little trumped up as well. I mean, similar kinds of thing going on here.
Right.
And now we don't hear a whole lot about it.
Right. Well, I think people realized it was a very useful political issue. So people who weren't from Lower Manhattan, they were from Georgia, they were from Alaska, they were from wherever they were. They thought they could get some political traction by going to this issue. To me, that's the troubling part, is, how big is the constituency of these people who are just, sufficiently frightened by the prospect of a mosque thousands of miles away from their home that they're going to get really agitated about it. Clearly in the face of the First Amendment, right, which says that people can put their places of worship up wherever they want to put them up. They don't have to be 10 blocks from Ground Zero. They don't have to be 20 blocks from Ground Zero. That's the piece that troubled me. I know there's always cranks who think this. The piece that troubled me was to see it move up into the realm of respectability. But I don't think the media did that. I think that was done pretty self-consciously by people who were running campaigns.
Create any foreign policy implications? The community center in New York City?
Well, only, I think, in the sense that, we do have adversaries in the world who wish to portray the United States and the American people as hostile to Islam, and this provides those people with ammunition. I'm with you. I think we are at a very odd moment in our politics where there's a lot of anger among substantial numbers of our fellow citizens. I think the anger partly is derived from economic distress. I personally think that the anger is to some degree related to race and discomfort in certain sectors of society that people not like me are now running things, as it were. But there's discomfort that relates to 9/11 and the war on terror. And so this just creates an opportunity for cynical politicians to just grab hold of the mosque issue and just ride it.
And this is one place where this old conditional covenantal idea that goes back to Winthrop and the Puritans, whenever there was a problem in Puritan society, the assumption always was that we screwed up. we did something wrong. That's one piece I love about that particular idea, that we're in this special relationship with God, but when something goes wrong, it isn't because the Indians did something. It isn't because the French did something. It isn't because the British did something. It's because we did something. We were supposed to not be social climbing. We were supposed to be taking care of the poor. We didn't do it. That's so sorely missing. We're so quick to go to, our economy's in the dumps, so it must be the Muslims who are doing this. And we don't say it in that way, because when we say it that way, it sounds ridiculous. But I do think this idea of a kind of nostalgia for the good times, and these aren't the good times. So it's the immigrants, it's the Muslims, it's something else. And I sort of long for the olden days, my own nostalgia, when people would say, what are we doing wrong here? What did we do to cause this problem? And what sacrifices can we make? Another theme of your writing, that we don't ask much. What sacrifices can we make to get us out of this situation?
You just heard from Professor Stephen Prothero. He's sitting up there with Professor Andy Bacevich. I'm going to try and whip us through a few more questions because we've got a book signing and a little noshing to get to in a moment. So let's go right over here.
A lot of this conversation tonight has been sort of the underlying cultural roots of America and sort of our exceptionalism that way. And I think that especially the Niebuhr conversation is an incredibly valid analysis of that cultural root system and why some of our hubris gets caught up in those things. I was wondering, because Niebuhr did write in a particular world, even Winthrop did write in a particular world, and speaking as someone who was very much born into 9/11, for me, it was not a conversion like George W. Bush. My conception of the world is formed very much from 9/11 on, as I think a 9-year-old at that point. The USSR did not exist when I was born on September 6, 1992. I think maybe that was in its last throes, but my map of Russia is considerably smaller than many other people's maps of Russia. And I was wondering if the differences between my generation are so great, are they great enough maybe to be able to change our culture enough to find a solution to some of these problems, or are the cards still stacked against us considerably?
It's got your name on it.
Really? I'm totally hopeful about young people. I'm totally bullish on young people, if that's what the question is. If you look at polling data on so many issues in America that I find the American public in a troubling place, younger people seem to be in a better place. Now the problem with young people is they grow up to be old people. And they start to develop the prejudices that older people have. So I rather doubt that your generation will be without them. But I suspect that people who are 18 today are less worried about the specter of Islam, for example, than people who are 50 or who are 60. Part of that also has to do with the fact that young people live in a world that is more multiracial and multi-religious. Part of that is geographical, urbanization. Part of it's travel. A huge part of it is the internet, right? You can have friends on Facebook who are in India, and you can be in connections with them in some ways, or who live in Ghana in ways that young people, when I was growing up, I didn't have any friends in India or in Ghana because there was no way for me to do that. So I'm hopeful about that. I think, though, that the way through that is not by pretending away these problems, but by looking square at them. In my case, in the religious studies side, looking square at the differences between religious traditions instead of pretending that everything's fine. And in the case of foreign policy, looking at the hard choices rather than pretending that, gee, if we just could spread democracy a little more effectively at the point of a gun, that things would be better. So I suppose if the idealism meets a kind of realism, then that might be the best of all worlds.
I suppose I'm less bullish and would offer two challenges to your generation. The first would be to consider the possibility that the purpose of higher education is other than occupational, that you don't come to Boston University so that you can get a degree that's going to produce a job, and without trying to be too judgmental about it, it does seem to me that the temper of our student body as a whole tends to be viewing education in this way. This is my ticket to a good life. I think it needs to be more than that. And let me emphasize that when I was your age, I didn't think any of these things. And the second thing is, and I profess that I'm completely sort of baffled and puzzled by it all, but I wonder, you were citing sort of the communications revolution as it allows you to have friends in Nigeria and Ghana. My sense is that to some degree, the impact of the communications revolution on your generation is to cause everybody to turn inward. That you don't communicate to your friend in Ghana, you can communicate to your best 3 friends in life that you haven't seen since breakfast, and you're arranging to where you're going to meet them for lunch. That there is there are constraints, there's a narrowness that I sense as an outside observer of your generation, you know, what do I know, that I think ought to at least be examined.
Okay, I'm going to go right over here to the corner for a question.
This is a question for Professor Bacevich. I am wondering if you see a moral dimension in the shift of the U.S. economy since World War II toward a permanent war economy in terms of its effects domestically, and if so, do you see alternatives out there?
Well, it's an interesting question. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower identified in his farewell address certainly existed then and exists today. That said, by most measures, that military-industrial complex is less important in terms of our overall economy today than it was then. In the 1950s, roughly 50% of the federal budget went to Department of Defense or defense programs. 50%. Now it's about 17%. During the Cold War, on average, we spent 10% of GDP on the military. Today, even with the enormous increases in spending under President Bush, I think we spend about 4.2% of GDP on defense. These are not trivial numbers by any means, simply saying they're not as large proportionally as they used to be. It's certainly true that the president of Raytheon is going to get his phone call answered in the White House before I get mine answered. So these people exercise influence on the administration in the Congress. That said, I don't think that we should be aware of, sensitive to, and concerned about the influence of the military-industrial complex. I don't think it's appropriate for us to see that as the big boogeyman. You know, were it to not exist, that all of our problems would be solved. One of the points I try to make in this Washington Rules book is it seems to me that Washington has embraced, and we as people are conditioned to accept, a military posture that certainly serves the interests of the military-industrial complex, but has an existence that goes beyond the military-industrial complex. So, for example, the notion that we should configure U.S. military forces not to defend the country. That's not their job to defend the country. Department of Homeland Security defends the country. We should configure U.S. military forces for the purposes of global power projection is something that we have all accepted as just the way we do business. And we don't question, and we ought to question, whether or not that long-standing habit is contributing to American peace and prosperity or undermining American peace and prosperity. And I think a strong case can be made, it's undermining our peace and prosperity. So the fix must go beyond simply trying to curb the military-industrial complex.
We're going to take 2 more questions. First one, we're going to go online.
This question actually came over Facebook. It's from an alum. He is watching from the Ukraine, and he wants to know, he says, I currently chair the Green Party in the eastern region of the Ukraine, and local elections are going to take place this weekend. During the election campaign, I get asked questions about civil society and whether the same standards of civil society can be applied in the Ukraine or anywhere else outside of the European Union or the US. Some concerns are that local traditions may contradict standards of civil society praised by Western countries. Please help.
That's you. That's you.
Well, I don't know much about Ukrainian politics. I don't think I even know much about developing civil society. My guess is that this is something that has to develop organically, that whatever practices or institutions would evolve in Ukrainian politics do have to have Ukrainian roots, reflect Ukrainian traditions, and that the notion that a Western-style civil society can be grafted onto Ukraine probably would produce a lot of frustration.
Okay, we're going to go final question right here.
A minute ago, you mentioned of people blaming things on other countries. For example, you said, well, our economy's in the dumps, we're going to blame X. Why do you think Muslims have encountered so much intense prejudice in America, whereas even larger numbers of, say, Indians are moving to America, and while in fact that's a very testy subject with the economy and outsourcing and such, why do you think that the Muslims, while they may not be from any country that has any terrorist ties whatsoever, why do they encounter prejudice while, for example, Indians may not?
I think the real danger is Hinduism. I'm glad you brought that up. No, it's a really good.
What is it that we should burn?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, right. But see, we don't even know what to burn when it comes to Hinduism, right? Do we burn the Mahabharata or the Ramayana or the Bhagavad Gita? I think that's a great question. I think, I've thought about this a little bit comparatively, right? Ways in which the current fear of Muslims is like prior fears in America of other religious groups, right? So the anti-Catholic fervor of the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, anti-Semitism in American society, the internment camps when we put basically all the Buddhists in America who were Japanese into internment camps in World War II. The first people to go in those camps, by the way, were Buddhist priests. One of the reasons was because we didn't know the difference between Buddhism and Shinto. And Shinto is a tradition that has emperor worship, that's nationalistic. And we didn't know that, we thought the Buddhist priests were like Shinto priests worshiping the emperor, so we thought they were a danger to the state. It was sort of internment by religious illiteracy, you might say. So some of the parallel, first of all, Catholics, there were a lot more Catholics in America in the middle of the 19th century than there are Muslims now. There were cities that had, 20%, 25% Catholics. We don't have cities like that in America with Muslims, so it's a teeny percentage compared to, so our fear of Catholics in that sense was more rational in the middle of the 19th century. In that sense, Muslims are more like Jews, that they've always been, at least in America, a small portion. And this is different from the way it is in some European countries that are having a kind of anti-Islamic fervor, where you have the percentages in places like Holland and Germany at like 6, 8, 9% of Muslims, so a significant minority that we don't have in the United States. Another factor, Muslims hijacked 3 jets and flew them into buildings, right? So it isn't the fear is not just all made up, right? There are Muslims in the world who want to kill us, right? So it isn't all kind of craziness, right? So that's another factor. For me, religious illiteracy is huge because we're incapable of distinguishing between, these crazy Muslims who want to hijack planes and these Muslims like my lovely student Mansoura, who's here, who is not sitting here plotting to overthrow the US government or to kill me or anything like that, right? We don't know enough about Islam, and we don't know enough Muslims in our own lives to be able to dismiss the prejudices and fears from our head. I will say, in terms of this issue with Juan Williams that came out recently, where he expressed, when I get on a plane and I see someone who's dressed as a Muslim, it makes me afraid. I think we need to have conversations like that, where people are willing to say, what it is about Islam that scares them. I think that would flush out a lot of misinformation, and it would help with our educational process. So I think I'm not answering your question very well. I think there's a lot of different factors, but the factor that I alluded to before that I should add is that we also have politicians who are willing to trade on stoking those fears in a very cynical way. And instead of seeing those politicians as demagogues who are using prejudice and hatred for their own political purposes and dividing our country and saying shame on them, we are allowing them to manipulate us. So I think there's a lot of different factors.
We're going to have to make that the last word. Thank you very much. Give them a round of applause. Professor Andrew Bacevich, Professor Stephen Prothero.